We are, as a society, obsessed with this idea of equality. And this isn't something new. This is an obsession that the founders shared with us more than 200 years ago, when they couldn't get through the first 2 sentences of our first official document without talking about equality. So here we are with the founders, who can't get through the first 2 sentences of our first official document without talking about equality. And they say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal. Yeah, except. That can't be right. I mean, look at yourselves. Some of you are smarter than others. Some of you are more attractive than others. Some of you are stronger than others. Some of you are more talented than others. But all of these differences that you see, this is not what the founders had in mind when they talked about equality and inequality. All of this stuff is diversity. We're all different in very fundamental ways. When the founders talked about equality, they meant that we were equal in the political sense, that no one of us has the right to rule over any others of us without those others' consent. And yet today, when we talk about inequality, what it brings to mind is not the sense of equality in the political sense, but rather this sense of the haves and the have-nots. Some people have much and other people have less. But this thinking of the haves and the have-nots hides an important distinction. That is, there are really 2 types of equality when you think about it in terms of the haves and the have-nots. There's equality of outcome and there's equality of opportunity. And those 2 types of equality interact in an interesting way with diversity. If you have a diverse population and you subject them to equal opportunities, those who are stronger, more attractive, maybe born into better circumstances, they will advance farther, and you will end up with unequal outcomes. Conversely, if you take this diverse population and you subject them to unequal opportunities, then you can achieve equal outcomes. The moral of the story is, you cannot be for or against equality or inequality. You can only be for or against a particular combination of both. If you are for equality of opportunity, then you are by definition also for inequality of outcome. And if you are for equality of outcome, then you are by definition also for inequality of opportunity. If you have a diverse population, those 2 equalities and inequalities will necessarily go together. Now, you might say, okay, yes, but I see the loophole here. All we have to do is eliminate diversity, make everybody the same. The problem with that is, look at what diversity has given us. All of the wonderful things we have precisely because you can do things that I can't. And I can do things that you can't. And when you do what you're good at and I do what I'm good at, we can exchange and we both become better off and we get all of this wonderful stuff. So we're back to this choice. You only get one of these types of equality, equality of opportunity or equality of outcome. You must choose. I'm going to make tonight a case against equality of outcome. And I start with this argument that if we're for equality of outcome, then poverty is the easiest way to attain this. There are 2 possible outcomes here if your goal is equality of outcome. One is you make everybody equally poor. The other is that you make everybody equally rich. Now, that first one, that's easy to do. We could achieve in this country equality of outcome within 6 months to a year. All we have to do is everybody go home, find a couch, sit on it, and do nothing else for the next 12 months. And we will achieve equality of outcome. We will all be equally poor. Because why? Poverty is a default condition. It's what happens when you don't do anything. And so consequently, it's very easy to achieve. To achieve equality of outcome with everyone being rich, that's very hard. And we have centuries of evidence of this. Every single government throughout history that has made a concerted effort to achieve equality of outcome for its people has invariably ended up achieving poverty, because that's the easiest way to get equality of outcome. Another argument against equality outcome equality emphasizes the wrong thing. Now I'm going to talk about profit here, and I want to make a distinction right off. There are two types of profit. There's the involuntary profit on the left, and that's a problem. There's the voluntary profit on my left, on your left. That's not a problem. Where two people come together and they exchange something voluntarily and they earn a profit. That's okay. Now, let's look at this voluntary profit. We've got a guy who has a car and a guy who has some money, and they come together and they want to exchange, and so they do, and they both end up better off. And how do I know this? Because it was a voluntary transaction. If they weren't going to end up better off, they would not have engaged in the transaction. Now, there are some transactions in which we engage in them and we end up worse off, but we learn. You say, oh my God, you wake up the next day and you say, I'm never doing that again, right? And largely speaking, we don't. So there's some trial and error here, but generally speaking, when you have a voluntary exchange, both parties walk away better off than they were before. Now, take this example of this exchange and let's repeat it. And other people come to see this guy and they buy cars from this guy. Now, those of us who are concerned about outcome equality would look at this and they would focus on this one guy with all the dollars. And they would say, there's a problem here because the dollars are all concentrated in the hands of this one guy. And that view completely misses the goods and services. The cars are all distributed amongst many people. This guy, Steve Jobs, dies with $8 billion in the bank. You know how he got it? We gave it to him. We gave him our money because we liked our iPhones better than we liked the dollars in our pocket. Now, I ask you, how many of you here has $1 billion in the bank? Now, I can't see you because of the lights, but I don't need to see you because I know there are no hands up right now. There are some people who have $1 billion, but there's very few of them, and they have lots and lots of dollars compared to the rest of us. But now, let me ask you, how many of you has a smartphone? And again, I don't need to see you because I know every single hand would go up. I doubt there's a single person in this room who doesn't have a smartphone. How do I know that? I know that because amongst young people in this country, 98% plus of them own smartphones. I also know that 2% of you just whipped out your smartphones to check that statistic. So let's go back and look at this transaction between the guy who sells the car and the guy who buys the car, and there they are, they perform this, and let's repeat this. But this time, as we repeat the transaction, let's buy from a different person. And so this second guy buys his car from that second seller, and these other people, they buy their cars from other sellers, and we look at that scenario through the eyes of equality of outcome, and we say, oh, that's good. That's lots of equality going there because the dollars are all spread around. Completely missing the fact that it's the same dispersion of goods. It's the goods and services that matter, not the dollars. Dollars are simply a tool we use to convey ownership of goods and services. And so someone who looks at the world through the eyes of equality of outcome would look at these two scenarios and claim that the one on the left is a scenario of inequality, the one on the right is a scenario of equality. But if you ask the people who are sitting in the cars, yeah, they think they're all equal. We've all got smartphones. They all have cars. Focusing on outcome equality demonizes something good. Here's a guy who's come to live in a community and he does stuff. He paints houses or fixes cars or mows people's lawns, this sort of thing. And he does this for the community and he needs things in return, and he asks in return some food and clothing and shelter. Okay? Now, let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that society highly values this lawn mowing and the car fixing and the house painting. Maybe there aren't many people who do that, or maybe he's particularly good at it, or maybe there's a huge demand for it, whatever the reason. Let's suppose that society highly values that stuff that this guy does. And let's also suppose that society, for whatever reason, doesn't value the food, the clothing, the shelter that he's looking for. Maybe they have lots of it laying around, or it's very easy to produce. But here's our scenario. Now, if I described this to anybody, they'd say, oh yes, this is perfect. This is the kind of society I want to live in, where people are providing for others more than they ask for in return. Okay? But let's superimpose on top of this scenario a monetary system. And remember, the purpose of money is simply to aid in the transfer of ownership of goods and services. So we have this guy, and he provides these things that society really wants. And what does society do? The people give him lots of dollars because they really highly value this stuff that he's doing. And in exchange, they give him food, clothing, shelter, and they only ask for a few dollars back. Why? Because they don't value this stuff that much. And what happens over time? Over time, this guy accumulates a pile of dollar bills. And we, looking at this through the eyes of equality, would say, well, there's a problem here because this guy has lots of dollars, the other people don't have lots of dollars, and we're completely missing what's going on. This guy is providing more value to society than he's asking for in return. Those dollars, those are IOUs. That's society saying to him, you have given us more than you have asked for. We owe you stuff. Here, take these pieces of paper, and when you're ready for the stuff that we owe you, hand them over and we'll give you more stuff. The pile of dollars is not a sign that he needs to give back to the community. It's a sign that he has already given to the community. 4, we don't measure equality well. Tell me something. Do you care about this type of inequality? The poor, the rich, and the super rich? Or do you care about this kind of inequality? People who have plenty and people who have not enough. Most people who have any concern about equality, or even just a general sense of humanity, would look at the second one and say, that's the one of the two that bothers me. That there are some people who don't have enough and other people who have way more than they need. Okay. But the metrics that we use when we talk about inequality, we talk about inequality growing or falling or whatever it's doing, the metrics don't measure that second kind that's important. They measure this. So from year to year, it could be the case that of the 350 million of us, 349,999,998 have the same income next year as we did this year, but next year, Bill Gates earns a lot more money than Warren Buffett. And we do the inequality measures and we'll say, oh, inequality has gone up. Yeah, it doesn't matter if inequality goes up between Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. Yeah, but it will drive the numbers. Now, we can get around this problem by grouping the rich together. So this is what I'm going to do. I'll show you data on the United States, and I'm going to divide households, as the Census Bureau does, into 3 groups: the poor, the middle class, and the rich. And over there in the rich, I'm going to say anybody who has over $200,000 a year. Oh, and by the way, everything I'm going to show you is adjusted for inflation. Anybody who has over $200,000 a year, we'll call you rich. So I don't care if you've got a small yacht, or if you have a big yacht, or if your yacht has a yacht. All those people, they're rich. Put them in a big pile. Okay. I'm going to show you bars. The height of the bar shows you the fraction of households in each category. Here's the United States in 1970. In 1970, 2% of us were in that top category. Remember, this is adjusted for inflation. Also in 1970, 11% of us were in that bottom category. That's the United States in 1970. If you group them together into the three general categories, in 1970, roughly 30% of us were poor, 51% of us were middle class, and 19% of us were rich. That's the United States in 1970. Now, I'm going to move time forward. And as time moves forward, watch what happens to these bars. Now, from one year to the next, sometimes they go up, sometimes they go down, but look at the trend. As we go from 1970 to 2022, the last year for which we have data, over 50 years, half a century, what's happened? The middle class has shrunk. And you will hear this. People say, oh my God, the middle class is shrinking in the United States. That's absolutely correct, it is. In 1970, 51% of us are middle class. Today, only 39% are. The unspoken implication is that we become poor. Yeah, except that's not the case. In 1970, 30% of us were poor. Today, only 23% of us are. What happened to all these people? They moved into the rich categories. In 1970, 19% of us were rich. Today, 38% of us are rich. This over the course of 50 years. If that trend continues for just 30 more, 30 years from now, half of us will be rich and only 10% of us will be poor. Is there inequality up there on that high end? Absolutely there is. Compare Jeff Bezos to Bill Gates to Warren Buffett to whoever else you want to name. Yeah, there's inequality up there, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that left-hand section is shrinking, and it's shrinking steadily year after year. Finally, even if we do measure income inequality correctly, we tend not to understand it. We confuse it with poverty. This is the world in 1800, and that bubble, the height, represents a number of people, and its position, left to right, indicates income. So you're looking at the distribution of world income in 1800. And in 1800, oh, and by the way, you see that vertical line there? That's today's official definition of extreme poverty. Again, everything's adjusted for inflation. In 1800, that's how the world divided out. The poor, the middle class, the rich. And look at that. A decent chunk of the rich in 1800 were what today we would call poor. They were living at what today we consider the poverty line. That's the world in 1800. Now, I'm going to move time forward and watch what happens to this distribution. Now let's pause here in 1980, because this is the point where people start to really start talking about issues of equality around the world. And they looked at this, and what did they see? They saw a tremendous number of poor people over there on the left. The red is largely India and China. And then they looked over here on the right. The yellow is United States, Canada. The green is Europe. And they said, look, we're all rich and all these other people are poor. There's tremendous inequality here. We need to do something. What they were missing is they forgot where they came from. We didn't have a bunch of Chinese and Indians in 1980 who were poor because the rest of us made them poor. We were all poor. Some of us escaped. Some of us remained. Now, I'm not suggesting we shouldn't be concerned. I am, however, putting it into perspective that this was not a situation of one part of the world making the other part of the world poor. In fact, watch what happens as time advances. India and China start to catch up. And where do you end up? You end up here. Think back to the picture I gave you of 1800, where almost all of humanity was below the poverty line. Today, almost all of humanity is above it. Do we have inequality? Of course we do. Look at that big wide bubble there. We've got people who have tremendous amount, people who have less. What do we tend not to have? We tend not to have extreme poverty, not nearly in the way we had it 100, 200 years ago. And often, when we get concerned about issues of inequality, it's not the inequality that viscerally is bothering us, it's the poverty. It's very important that we keep these two distinct. So here we are. In conclusion, we're diverse, and because of the diversity, we're left with a choice. We can have equality of outcome, or we can have equality of opportunity, but by definition, you cannot have both. And I argue that the one that you don't want is equality of outcome. And the reason is because the easiest way to achieve it is to make everybody poor. Focusing on equality of outcome diverts our attention from the thing that matters, that's goods and services, to people have what they need, and focuses our attention on piles of dollar bills. And it demonizes something that's good. It demonizes the very people amongst us who are contributing more to society than they're asking for in return. In the end, we don't measure it correctly anyway, and when we do measure it correctly, we misunderstand what it is we're looking at. We think it's poverty. If you've enjoyed this, I encourage you to check out my podcast, Words and Numbers, and this excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion, How Busy Bodies Became Busy Bullies and What It Means for Economics and Politics. Thank you.